Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. My name is Josiah McGee. I'm here with my co-host, Olivia. Olivia, we said last week we were going to ask you where you were this week because you keep moving around. So you want to give us your weekly update? Where are you this week?
This week, I am back in the great state of Texas.
There you go. All right. Olivia is back home, so to speak, at least where your family is from. Happy to hear that you are back in Texas. Today is Wednesday, April 8th, 2026. And I'm saying the date because it is important, as always, because things move very, very rapidly. Last night, there was almost a major escalation in the war, and then there was almost a ceasefire, and then there wasn't. Then there was a ceasefire. So a lot of things happened in a few hours. And since then, today, there's also been quite a bit of rapid fire news and updates as far as whether or not the ceasefire is holding, whether Iran is attacking different countries across the region despite the ceasefire. Spoiler alert, they are. And it raises some questions about, okay, is the war over or not? What's actually happening right now? Things move very rapidly. So we're recording this in the afternoon of April 8, 2026. Hopefully by tomorrow morning, all of this information will still be relevant. And we hope that this conversation is helpful to you as well. So we're going to jump right into it. First things first, we'd want to just cover basically how did the ceasefire happen, because it was a little bit of a surprise to some people, I think. And what's interesting, especially, is Israeli counterparts to the U.S. administration have been leaking or making statements to the press that they were a bit surprised by this and, in fact, disappointed. Sorry to all of the conspirators who believe that Israel has been pulling the strings and controlling this war. That does not seem to be the fact, given that they were surprised by and rather disappointed by the ceasefire. But it, of course, does raise some questions about, okay, how did this actually happen? So I'm just going to give a very high-level overview, paint in some very broad brushstrokes, and that Olivia can add some commentary as well in terms of what factors do you think contributed to this, Olivia? And then we'll see where the conversation takes us from there. So as far as how this happened, of course, there was a lot of back and forth. I think it's interesting just to call out a few of the key players and the conversations that led to the ceasefire. It was mediated by the government of Pakistan. And this is interesting for a number of reasons, which we can dig into if you want to, Olivia. But it's interesting that a week ago, it seemed like everyone considered the government of Pakistan to have failed in its mission to mediate some sort of agreement or ceasefire between the various parties. And then all of a sudden, it seems like they figured it out. They found a formula to make it work. I think it is important to note that there was an infusion, apparently, or supposedly, of some other parties which may have sort of pushed things over the edge and helped get this ceasefire across the finish line. A few people that were late additions to the party, it sounds like, were Vice President Vance on behalf of the United States, as well as the Chinese, apparently helping to convince Iran to play along. A lot going on there. I mean, there's a lot of different cooks in the kitchen and different people that were involved and supposedly helping to make this ceasefire happen. But it is good to note all the different people who will be trying to claim some credit for it if it goes well, and avoiding credit or blame if it does not go so well. Previously, Iran had, of course, rejected the idea of a temporary ceasefire. So that's part of what made this new development so surprising, is they had been pretty committed to the idea that if there was going to be an end to the war, it had to be a permanent end to the war with a significant number of guarantees. A temporary ceasefire was not on the table for Iran. And now all of a sudden we have a 2-week ceasefire that is temporary in nature and is contingent upon the successful negotiation of a permanent end to the war. Otherwise, in 2 weeks' time, the war presumably would restart. And last but not least, President Trump's rhetoric and actions over the last week, of course, have drawn quite a bit of attention. He had threatened to seriously escalate attacks on Iran last night, and adding a number of targets that had previously not been included because they would be considered so escalatory. Things like power plants, other forms of energy infrastructure, transportation, railroads, bridges, these sorts of things, all of which you could make a case are valid and legitimate military targets. But again, because they were considered such a significant escalation, had not been on the table up until this week. And then President Trump threatened to basically attack all of those if Iran did not meet his timeline to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and accept a ceasefire. Iran apparently agreed kind of, sort of, to Trump's ultimatum. It's unclear, we'll get to that in a moment, about what exactly was agreed to, but that's the basic landscape of what led up to this two-week ceasefire announcement last night. Olivia, would you like to add anything? What are you observing as far as factors that you think were contributing or interesting to discuss as it relates to the ceasefire?
Yeah, I think there's just a couple things that are probably worth noting for people who just don't know a lot about the history of Iran and historical negotiations with Iran and things like that. Iran tends to shift positions when they feel they're under credible military or economic pressure. And I think that that kind of helps explain their sort of sudden movement after rejecting that temporary ceasefire so quickly. It also may explain why Trump put out such a harsh statement yesterday about, quote unquote, wiping out a whole civilization. Who knows what his motivation was behind posting that? But if I had to take a guess, it could potentially be the fact that it would put Iran under a specific amount of pressure, because Iran will do this thing where they will agree in principle, but then either leave room for interpretation or delay implementation, or just outright accept terms and then sort of claim that the other side violated, which is what we're basically seeing now with everything that's going on in Lebanon. And another thing that's also important to look out for is what they are saying in other languages that they're not saying in English. For example, it's being stated like by outlets like the Associated Press that the Farsi language version of the 10-point ceasefire plan, Iran actually included the phrase acceptance of enrichment for its nuclear programs, something that was then missing in the English version that was shared by Iranian diplomats to journalists. So that's just something to be aware of, that they are not coming to the table honestly here. They're not acting in good faith. And we really don't have any reason to believe that they would be doing that. And so it's just best in these situations to really tread carefully when we talk about all of these negotiations that are happening, because it's not usually such a black and white issue. So hopefully that can kind of color in some of the events that are happening around the ceasefire.
Yeah, that's helpful, Olivia. I think I would maybe quibble with one or two of the things that you said. So if you'll allow me for a moment to explain. There is a difference between Iran as a society and the regime. Iran as a society
100%.
is very susceptible to economic pressure. The regime itself is actually not very susceptible to economic pressure and has shown a willingness over the past several decades to accept a very high degree of financial cost and economic depression within the country in exchange for its own survival. So it's okay if there's pretty high economic costs to the people of Iran, if it means that the regime itself is going to survive whatever conflict it is in with the West. Now, to your point, I think the point that you're trying to make is that it is generally viewed as slightly more susceptible to financial costs that are imposed directly on the regime. And part of that is because the regime is built. I mean, it really is not unlike a mafia organization, essentially, that has been in many ways sort of running a state within Iran, running the country more or less from behind the scenes, and even more so now that many of Iran's leadership have been eliminated by this war. The level of corruption is massive. And of course, that means that there are certain pressure points you can find where you can impose financial costs directly on individuals who are reliant on patronage, bribery, the ability to pay people off in order to maintain their positions of authority, power, and things of that nature. I think that is a little bit more so where we seem to be getting in the last week or so, is not so much that the economic pressure on the country as a whole was increasing, but that the U.S. administration had perhaps begun to signal they were willing to take certain steps, which would put more pressure directly on the different networks of corruption within Iran and their funding sources through things like the energy plants, the oil refineries, and things like that. Now, you mentioned as well the idea that there was some confusion about what exactly is in the 10-point ceasefire plan. I do want to also just briefly explain for our listeners, there are essentially two separate frameworks that are being discussed and debated right now, which is part of why there's so much confusion and chaos if you're just trying to follow this story online. You have the 2-week ceasefire, and then you have two frameworks that are separate from each other, one proposed by the United States, one proposed by Iran, that are supposed to be frameworks for a permanent ceasefire or end to the war. And the gaps between those two have not been closed yet. But when people are trying to understand, what are the terms of this current 2-week ceasefire, part of why it's confusing is that it's really not based on the 15-point plan that President Trump put forward or the 10-point plan that Iran put forward. Those are just like opening negotiating positions for what is supposed to be talked about in the next 2 weeks. The terms of the 2-week ceasefire itself are a little bit simpler and yet at the same time very ambiguous and not able to be reported in a great amount of detail right now. There's quite a bit of disagreement, even over just the basic terms of what has to happen for us to not shoot at each other for the next 2 weeks. I'll give you a few examples of what that looks like right now. So, Olivia, you kind of mentioned some of this already, but we'll just unpack a little bit about what this means. One of the big issues, for example, is whether or not Lebanon is included or not. The reason why this matters is that Israel has been engaged in a fairly sizable operation in Lebanon, not as big as it would have been if not for the war against Iran, but still, a fairly sizable operation in Lebanon. And they've been trying to basically go after Hezbollah, which is a proxy or a client of Iran. Lebanon, as a country, has been trying to effectively get rid of Hezbollah, essentially, since this war started. They finally got to a point where the political level of leadership in Lebanon was willing to say, we're ready to cut ties with Hezbollah and enforce Lebanese laws, which outlaw the use of weapons by a non-state actor. Basically saying that they wanted to disarm Hezbollah, they wanted to be rid of the IRGC, or Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, from Iran, their influence in Lebanon. They tried to expel the Iranian ambassador. That didn't go very well, but there were various steps that Lebanon was trying to take, and Israel said, okay, this is an opportunity to actually make something happen and to finally deal with the problem of Hezbollah, disarm it, get rid of it once and for all. Iran's take, or what they've been telling people in the media, is that because Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran, that the ceasefire extends to them as well, essentially. That they're not supposed to shoot at Israel. Israel's not supposed to be shooting at Hezbollah. Lebanon is supposed to be off limits for the next 2 weeks. President Trump's take on this, as being reported through, or statements through his press secretary to the media, is that Lebanon was not included in the ceasefire because it's a separate issue. It's a war between Israel and Hezbollah. It's not part of the U.S.'s war against Iran that has been carried out in coordination with Israel. So it's very interesting. This is just one example of how the two sides are not on the same page about what the ceasefire includes and does not include and what the conditions are for the ceasefire. There's also quite a bit of disagreement about, does Iran still get to control passage through the Strait of Hormuz? Part of the idea behind the ceasefire was, okay, according to President Trump's ultimatum, it had to include an immediate opening of the Strait of Hormuz for safe passage of ships through this passage of water. What does that actually mean, though? Does President Trump mean that he thinks the Strait of Hormuz is totally open for commercial shipping? Does it mean that Iran is opening the strait but still gets to control who gets in and out, or can charge some sort of toll from ships who want to pass through those waters? They seem to think that's the case. The U.S. is saying, no, that's not the case. Or if it is the case, that the U.S. is somehow involved in that process, but Iran doesn't want the U.S. involved. So there's a lot that still needs to be clarified there, I would assume, in the next few days, if the ceasefire is actually going to hold. Another big issue is you have conflicting statements from Iran and from the White House on whether or not Iran has already agreed to allow the U.S. to retrieve buried enriched uranium, or does that still need to be negotiated as part of the negotiations for a permanent end to the war? The White House is signaling that they think there's already been some sort of agreement that the U.S. will eventually be allowed to retrieve nuclear material that Iran's not supposed to have. And Iran's saying, no, we think that we're going to keep it. And not only that, but also keep the right to further enrich that nuclear material or additional material in the future. So the two sides are very far apart in terms of what the ceasefire conditions actually are. At this point, I think the only thing that really seems black and white is that there's a general end to the shooting at each other between the United States and Iran in exchange for negotiations over the next 2 weeks. And that's about it as far as what seems very black. Now, the other thing that I think we have to consider is whether these negotiations are actually going to succeed or not based on some of these gaps. But before we get into the negotiations to permanently end the war, Olivia, do you have anything to comment on as far as what I just said?
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on, like, obviously there's very clearly a breakdown between the two sides and obviously way more complexity on, like, what are the actual terms of negotiation, and then the fact that it seems to be a layered plan with different tracks depending upon the timeline. When breakdowns like this happen, is that there's obviously not one straight answer to this, but I'm assuming it's a mixture of cultural barrier, language barrier, interpretation of different facts within the negotiation. Is there anything that could explain like why there seems to be such confusion in like what the terms actually are between the two countries right now? I guess three.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things. You mentioned a few things as far as there's cultural barriers, there's language barriers. And to your point, part of what's been so interesting is what's being reported in English and in Farsi is different, both as it relates to this ceasefire and the proposals for a permanent end to the war. There's some useful context, though, I think, in terms of we take a step back and think about both previous ceasefires that this administration has negotiated and think about what President Trump has been saying about this current iteration of Iran's leadership. And I think you kind of get a sense for what's going on here. Number one, if you go back to the negotiations for a ceasefire in Gaza late last year, for example, there was a lot of confusion about how come the ceasefire is being announced while at the same time the US is saying one thing, Israel's basically saying the same thing, and Hamas is saying something very different in terms of what they've agreed to. And at the end of the day, what it basically came down to was most people's read of the situation was that the US and the Israeli side of the negotiations had basically got to a point where they said, we can accomplish something by getting this ceasefire. And even though we have no realistic expectation that the other side actually agrees, we can still force good things to happen if we push the ceasefire through, and then we'll deal with the consequences later. And the assumption is this isn't really the end to the war between Israel and Hamas. Eventually, there's going to be more conflict later, but it's worth taking a tactical pause for now in order to accomplish a specific objective that we have in mind. And Hamas can say whatever they want to because we're getting what we need to out of the deal anyways. Doesn't really matter what Hamas says. I think you can probably translate a lot of that to what's happening right now is Iran's going to say what Iran wants to. Do the two sides actually agree to everything that they say they agree to? Probably not. Do they agree to enough that both sides can get what they want out of the ceasefire? Maybe. And that remains to be seen, but that seems to be something that it certainly is a plausible scenario. The other thing that I think is very interesting context as far as how President Trump has been thinking about this new iteration of Iranian leadership is he's been consistently saying that he thinks they're going to find things perhaps they have found or hopes that they're going to find, or that he's looking for someone within Iranian leadership to step up and basically recreate the new regime or create a new regime that he can work with, that he can trust. And frankly, I think what's happening right now is President Trump is testing whoever it is that he thinks he can negotiate with or is negotiating with right now to see, can I work with you? I mean, are you trustworthy or not? Are you going to follow through on the agreements? Are you going to change the terms after the fact? Are you going to violate the terms of the agreements? And perhaps more importantly, do you have the ability to actually enforce the agreement on your side? Not to hold accountable other people, but to hold accountable your own people. Because right now, the leadership of Iran is very fractured. It's divided into several different factions. It's not at all clear who's calling the shots at all times. I mean, there's definitely some confusion, some chain of command questions right now in Iran. Honestly, that's probably part of why there have been several violations of the ceasefire already coming out of Iran, is because the chain of command is so broken and confused right now in Iran. So Trump, I think, is giving them 2 weeks to sort it out and say, can you figure it out? Who's in charge? And whoever is in charge, whoever you say is in charge, are they actually in charge? And can I trust them to work with them? And if not, well, okay, then I think this ceasefire is probably not going to make it 2 weeks. Or if it does, it will not necessarily mean the end of the war. But if Trump feels like he has found someone that it can actually prove themselves, now we have a really interesting conversation about what happens next. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. So then I guess the follow-up question to that is, like, given all of those factors, do you think the negotiations will succeed, and will the war actually end?
That is the question of the hour. Are these actually going to succeed, or is this just a blip and something that will maybe not even last for 2 weeks? I think there's a couple of challenges. One, I mean, as I've just mentioned, you have major questions about the stability of the current ceasefire, as is complicated by the number of different actors involved, the number of different units. I mean, the Iranian security apparatus alone, let alone the rest of its government, is very complex. It's broken down into many independent units that kind of work together, but also work semi-independently. And it's a design feature, not a flaw, that they designed to survive this sort of war. But it does make it very, very complicated to figure out, okay, can we actually pull together and unite around a set of negotiating positions? Not sure if Iran can do that right now. It remains to be seen. The second big challenge, and then I'll pitch it to you for your reactions, what you think about this. I think it's a challenge just how far apart the two negotiating sides are right now. I mean, it's pretty insane. If you look at the 15-point plan and the 10-point plan, honestly, I've not seen a detailed readout of either one of these that seems like it's the full version of what was sent to the respective sides. But you can find enough online being reported in various statements out of the governments to kind of get a sense for where the two sides are. The 15-point American plan, 10-point plan from Iran could not be more different. I mean, they disagree on very core issues that relate to the reason why the United States got involved in the war in the first place, the objectives of the war, everything that we've been saying since the beginning of the war about what would be required to end the war. And it's hard to imagine those two gaps really closing or being merged. A few examples of this. I mean, the United States expects total freedom for commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which you've already touched on. They expect an end to Iran's nuclear enrichment program, an end to Iran's ballistic missile program, or at least serious caps on it that are actually enforceable. They expect an end to Iran's regional influence through its various proxies. And these are all demands that have been very clear since the beginning. I mean, these were the first day of the war, the reasons given, even before that, the weeks leading up to the war. These are the reasons given why the United States went to war in the first place. And those demands haven't changed, according to the latest reporting that we're getting from different White House officials. Now, Iran's demands, in contrast, basically include reparations. The United States has to pay reparations for the damage done in Iran during the war, an end to U.S. military presence in the region. And you can see there the very clear contrast. The United States basically says you have to dismantle all of these terrorist organizations you've created across the Middle East, or at the very least, stop communicating with them and funding them. And Iran says, actually, what we want is to keep them, and you have to pull all of the American troops in the Middle East out. And we get the Middle East to ourselves, and you leave us alone entirely. Wild difference in terms of the two positions and two sides that everyone's bringing to the table. Iran also demands things like lifting sanctions and releasing economic pressure. Again, I don't think they care so much about economic pressure on the country, but definitely care about economic pressure on the regime itself, which is what these sanctions have been doing for the past several years. They also want guarantees of no future war, things like some sort of guarantor, whether that's the United Nations or someone else, various promises the United States will never go to war with Iran again. And they want all of this in exchange for basically meeting none of the U.S. demands. So you can imagine that these are inherently contradictory. They're mutually exclusive. You can't have it both ways. Who's going to bend? Who's going to give in? I mean, Iran is a totalitarian regime built on ideology above all else. It's very hard to imagine them bending. The United States, on the other hand, definitely has the upper hand militarily right now. That much is obvious. So there's not really a lot of incentive for the United States to bend, particularly given that we have very good reasons why we got into the war in the first place. So what's the outcome? I mean, if I'm looking at this, I look at this thinking one of two things is going to happen. Either there's going to be some pretty significant changes in Iran's leadership that are going to allow them to agree to a deal that previously would be considered inconceivable, or the war is probably going to resume in 2 weeks because the United States is very unlikely to give in to some of Iran's really unreasonable demands.
Interesting. Ideology. I think if I were to answer the question, I'd say too, like, you make a great point about how the regime is ideology at its core above all else. And I think that is something that Americans have a really hard time understanding, that they are essentially designed by their ideology to be willing to play a long game, which is something that Americans just are not very good at comprehending. The ideology going into negotiations on the Iranian regime side is completely different than the ideology on the American side. I remain pretty skeptical that negotiations will succeed, largely because, I mean, you just laid it out yourself. I mean, the two sides seem so irreconcilable. Like, I just don't know what middle ground they could possibly find. And I also think, I'll bring up these points, but then add on to something you said as well is that Iran has consistently proven themselves to be untrustworthy. And I don't think anybody really has a reason to believe that they could sit across from negotiators and really act in good faith because their pattern has been so consistent. I mean, they built nuclear facilities without declaring them. They violated the NPT. They violated the JCPOA by surpassing uranium enrichment levels and limiting inspectors from the IAEA. You could also argue that they, violated plenty of other aspects of the JCPOA in, the spirit of the law. They have been the leading state sponsor of terrorism since 1984. And I don't think anybody, just based on, historical precedent, should be inclined to believe the Iranian regime leadership in negotiations because they've not given us or the rest of the world really any reason to believe them. And they've also proven that they're willing to lie in order to retain power. Now, that being said, I think you pointed something out that I hadn't even thought of before, which is the possibility that Trump is doing this as sort of like a test tactic to see if the leadership that's in power now is somebody that he could potentially work with. Now, if that's true, then that might change the way that I would still be incredibly skeptical, but it may give me more faith that something could potentially work out if it does prove to hold.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really the question right now is who is President Trump actually negotiating with, and what is that person really like? One of the things I think is very interesting, I heard this recently on a different podcast, I forget which one, I'm sorry, but there's something to be said for the nature of negotiations like this, negotiations to end wars. They typically, if you're dealing in negotiations without the context of the pressure of trying to end a war, it's a little bit easier to find terms which are mutually beneficial and agreeable. When you're having negotiations about permanent status for the future, in the context of also trying to end a war, it's quite a bit more difficult because there is significantly less shared trust of each other. There is quite a bit of enhanced concern among your domestic constituents about, is this a good idea? Is this going to work? The ability to sell it to, on our side, the American voter. In Iran, they don't really have to sell it to voters, but the ability to sell it to the public is still something of a consideration. Those are things that do play a role in terms of how easy it is or how difficult it is generally to conduct negotiations in the context of trying to end a war. Usually the factor that makes it easiest to push those negotiations across the finish line when you're trying to do so in the middle of a war is if you've reached a point where one side or the other clearly understands and acknowledges that they've lost the war. In the absence of either party thinking that they have lost the war, both sides are going to think that they're right. They're going to dig in. They're going to make it very, very difficult to finish these negotiations. And that's part of why right now I would say, I'm with you, Olivia. I'm skeptical. I mean, I look at the gaps between these two parties and I say, the only thing that would really make it easy to close those gaps is if one side or the other was willing to accept the fact that they lost the war and then give in as a result. And right now, you really don't see that. I mean, the United States militarily clearly has an upper hand and is speaking and acting as if that were the case, because it is. Iran, on the other hand, is militarily very weak right now, but is absolutely refusing to acknowledge any weakness and is claiming to have won the war up until this point by getting to the point where a ceasefire is being discussed. So I don't know. I don't see a clear path. And that's not to say that it's impossible. Certainly it is possible to conduct negotiations, even on these very difficult conditions and circumstances. But I think it's maybe the best thing for us to say is that it won't be easy. Rather than trying to predict what's going to happen, we'll just say it won't be easy for this to go well. It'll be very, very, very difficult and complicated. With that in mind, I want to maybe close our conversation by just discussing briefly, how should Christians respond to this? Olivia, maybe I'll give you the first stab at this question if you want.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really easy. As I was just like even prepping for our podcast episode, I was just like looking through all the news and I was like so bombarded by the fact that, this is evolving literally minute by minute. And there's so much confusion and so many different narratives about winning and losing and, all of these different things that you're hearing from either side. And, as somebody who does social media for a living, it can be very easy to want to be the first one to catch a story and the first one to post about something and the first one to say like the edgy narrative. And I think as Christians, it's important to sit back for a second and make sure we're being prudent in how we respond to things and not sort of getting caught up in that frenzy that can happen when the news is moving so quickly. because there really are things about this that we're not going to know with certainty until days, if not weeks from now. And it's okay not to be the first one to rush to make a comment on every single issue. That's probably, I say that to Christians, I say that to myself as well.
Yeah, it's a good reminder, I think, especially when you're swimming in this space as often as you are, Olivia. I think it's very easy to just sort of be overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there, and in trying to absorb all of it, respond to all of it. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot to take in and be thinking about. There's a few things that I was also thinking about as we prepped for this episode, and as I was just processing the news this morning about everything that was coming out last night. I think one of the things that definitely stood out to me as I was reading all of the news and reactions and statements that different people were making was it's just really important to not get swallowed up in the debate about who, quote unquote, won the war just yet. Everyone claims that they've won. And frankly, right now, everyone needs to claim that they won in order for this 2-week ceasefire to last. It's ironic because in order for a permanent ceasefire to be reached, somebody's got to admit that they've lost at least enough to compromise enough to reach that permanent end to the war. But right now, in this 2-week window, for now at least, everyone needs to feel like they won in order for this 2-week pause in fighting to actually last. Doesn't mean that everyone actually did win, but if we're caught up in arguing about who's winning or who actually won, who did not, it's temporary. It's not really the point. That's not really the point right now. I mean, everyone's going to say what they need to say in order to get through the next 2 weeks. And getting caught up in that is only going to take you down some really strange rabbit trails, I think. The other thing that definitely stood out to me was diplomacy is certainly preferable to violence. War can be, contrary to many people, I know this is a controversial opinion. In my opinion, war can be, in limited cases, justified. But obviously, diplomacy is preferable. We don't celebrate war. We don't want war to happen for war's sake. We would rather there be peaceful diplomatic solutions to our problems, of course. That being said, I think it's important to stay realistic and even-keeled. Just because we want diplomacy to work in the next 2 weeks doesn't mean that it's guaranteed to work in the next 2 weeks. And if we aren't careful about trying to stay even-keeled about this process and observing the process as it plays out, the next 2 weeks are going to feel like a roller coaster that is just going to thoroughly exhaust people. So I would strongly encourage anyone listening to this, yes, of course, we're hoping for and praying for a peaceful solution, but just be careful, be cautious, cautiously optimistic, and try to stay as even-keeled as possible as you read the headlines and observe what's going on the next 2 weeks. The region, of course, is starving for peace. Lasting peace, however, is very difficult to achieve. A 2-week ceasefire is one thing. Permanent end to this war, especially given the grievances that led to it, very, very difficult to achieve. It's very easy to critique from behind a keyboard or behind a podcast mic in our situation. I think we want to try not to do that. I mean, we're going to definitely keep talking about the ceasefire and negotiations as they're happening and reacting to it as responsibly as we can and in an informed manner to the best of our ability. But I think we just want to acknowledge that it's very, very difficult. And our position is not to critique people from our position behind a podcast mic, if that makes sense, or from behind a keyboard, to give the process a chance to play out. Let's just see what happens. The last thing I would say is that it's important to definitely be praying for wisdom and discernment and endurance, especially. I mean, you can imagine the amount of work that the negotiating teams are going to do over the next 2 weeks, the amount of travel that they'll be doing into various locations in order to meet with each other. But just pray for their strength as well as they face a very huge task ahead of them, that they would be wise, tiresome, and courageous about the work that they have been asked to do, which is to negotiate an end to this war. We'll close it with that. Olivia, any other last comments before we wrap this up?
No, you said it perfectly.
Amazing. I don't often do that, but I appreciate that. With that in mind, thank you everyone for tuning in today. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Lindsay as well for producing this episode. And we look forward to seeing you next week. And who knows what we'll be talking about, but it should be a fun conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Passages seeks to prepare and empower a new generation of Christian leaders who love God, stand with the Jewish people, and support Israel. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit www.passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep you connected to the pulse.